Captain Vexer stood tall in front of his class of elite combat cadets at the Galactic Military Academy. His forearms were crossed in the universal gesture of authority, and his iridescent scales flickered, a clear sign that he was barely holding in his amusement. Today's lesson was going to be unlike any other, and he could already tell that his cadets were about to be in for a surprise. "Listen up, you promising disappointments," Vexer announced, his voice firm and commanding. There was a pause before he added with a low rumble that his species used for laughter, "Today's lesson will be different." The cadets sat up straighter in their seats, intrigued. 300 of the galaxy's finest combat students from 27 different species leaned forward in anticipation. They had trained for years, perfecting their skills in various combat styles, each one tailored to their species' natural advantages. Some had claws, others had venomous fangs, and a few had reinforced exoskeletons. The anticipation in the amphitheater-style classroom was palpable, and every student could feel something unusual in the air. "High Command," Vexer continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "in their infinite wisdom, has decided that we need to integrate human hand-to-hand combat techniques into our curriculum." A stunned silence fell over the room. Cadet Cathal, a towering manadon with blade-like forearms, clicked his mandibles in disbelief. "Sir," he said, his voice filled with disbelief, "you can't be serious. Humans? They don't even have natural weapons." Vexer's smile grew wider, and he brought up a holographic display of human anatomy. The students gasped as they saw the image of a human, a creature with soft pink flesh, no claws, no venomous glands, and just 5 fingers on each hand. It was laughable. "Oh, I'm completely serious, Cadet," Vexer replied, his voice filled with mock seriousness. "No claws, no venom, no exoskeletons, just soft, weak flesh, and yet—" He paused, letting the suspense build. "High Command insists that humans have something to teach us." The cadets exchanged confused glances. They were experts in combat, having learned fighting techniques that made use of their species' natural abilities. They were powerful, fast, and deadly. How could these soft, weak humans possibly offer anything of value in the art of war? Vexer's hologram shifted, showing a series of human martial arts in action. The movements were slow, clumsy even, compared to the sharp, instinctive strikes that the cadets were accustomed to. The humans seemed to rely on brute force rather than speed or precision. To the aliens, the techniques looked inefficient and unrefined. "But there's something special here," Vexer said, his voice growing more serious. "You see, while you rely on your natural gifts, humans, they rely on something else. Determination, strategy, and adaptability." He looked out over the class, sensing their skepticism. "Tomorrow, you will experience it for yourselves. You will train with human combat instructors." The room fell silent. The cadets didn't know what to make of this. Humans? Training with humans. It sounded like a joke, but Vexer's tone left no room for humor. They were going to be taught by the same species they had once laughed at for their lack of natural abilities. As the class ended, the cadets filed out of the amphitheater, still murmuring among themselves, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. Some of them laughed it off, while others exchanged worried glances. They were about to face a challenge unlike any they had ever imagined. Tomorrow, they would learn the truth about humans, and they didn't know whether to be afraid or excited. The next day, the Galactic Military Academy was buzzing with excitement and uncertainty. The cadets gathered in the training hall, still trying to wrap their heads around the strange and unexpected announcement from Captain Vexer. For the first time in their lives, they felt a twinge of doubt. These were beings who had faced down the fiercest warriors across the galaxy, creatures with natural weapons and abilities that were unmatched. And now they were supposed to learn from humans. As they filed into the training hall, the atmosphere was tense. The usual clanking of weapons and clicking of mandibles that accompanied every class was replaced with quiet whispers. They lined up, awaiting the arrival of their instructors, their eyes on the door, expecting some sort of joke or elaborate test. But when the doors opened, they saw them. Humans. The first thing that struck the cadets was the size of the humans, smaller than most of them, yet their posture was unshakable, and their eyes burned with determination. There were no elaborate weapons or armor, just simple clothes and the unmistakable aura of calm confidence that only humans could carry. The lead instructor, a burly man with short brown hair and a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward. His name was Sergeant John McCree, and he looked completely unfazed by the collection of alien warriors before him. The humans were outnumbered, but they didn't show an ounce of fear. "All right, listen up, you all." Sergeant McCree's voice boomed, the sound carrying across the vast training hall. "Today, we start with the basics. This isn't about your fancy claws or venomous bites. This is about using what you have and what's in your mind. No shortcuts, no excuses." The cadets were skeptical, but they had no choice but to listen. McCree moved to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the group of alien warriors. "Let's see what you're made of. Pair up." The cadets hesitated for a moment, exchanging uncertain glances, but one by one they stepped forward. Caffel, the towering manadon, went first, selecting the human to spar with. The human was shorter than Caffel by half, but there was a quiet confidence in the way he held himself. McCree watched with a sharp eye as Caffel made the first move, charging forward with terrifying speed, his blade-like forearms poised to strike. He swung at the human, expecting to end the fight before it even began. But the human's movements were calm, calculated, and in the blink of an eye, Caffel found himself on the ground, his arms pinned to the floor with surprising ease. "What? How did you?" Caffel stammered, unable to comprehend what had just happened. McCree gave a small, knowing smile. "That's the first lesson. Strength doesn't always win. You have to learn control, leverage, and technique. Let's see if the rest of you can do better." As the sparring continued, the cadets began to realize something they hadn't expected. The humans weren't relying on physical strength or speed. They were using their opponent's momentum, timing, and positioning to their advantage. It was a strange and almost unnerving style, but it was effective. One by one, the cadets went up against the human instructors, and time and again, the humans managed to stay one step ahead, using nothing but their bodies and the technique they had mastered through years of training. Cadet Vela, a Zinthar with a reptilian exoskeleton, went next. She was known for her unyielding strength and her lightning-fast reflexes, and she attacked with everything she had. Yet within moments, her opponent, a human woman, had sidestepped her, using a fluid motion to bring her to the ground. "You didn't use your weight to your advantage," the woman said calmly, her voice filled with quiet assurance. "In a fight, your size can either be a strength or a weakness. It's all in how you use it." Vela slowly stood up, her mind racing. She had never experienced anything like this before. She had trained to overwhelm her opponents with her sheer power. But here, the human had used her own momentum against her. The technique was different, unpredictable, and far more effective than she had imagined. The cadets couldn't deny it any longer. The humans weren't just weak creatures. They had a completely different approach to combat. And it was working. Vexer watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable. He had known the cadets would be shocked, but he hadn't expected this level of resistance. They were learning faster than he had anticipated, each one of them grappling with the idea that their own combat methods weren't the only way to fight. The lesson had just begun, but already there was a shift in the air. As the day progressed, the cadets couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. Each sparring session revealed more about human combat techniques, and every alien, from the smallest to the largest, found themselves caught off guard. These humans weren't the weak, primitive creatures they had believed them to be. They were clever, resourceful, and most unsettling of all, they had the ability to adapt faster than any of the cadets. Captain Vexer stood near the training area, his sharp eyes watching the cadets closely. He wasn't impressed by the humans. He had seen many strange and dangerous species in his lifetime. But he was definitely intrigued. He had expected the cadets to overpower the humans easily, to squash them beneath their superior strength and abilities. Yet every time, the humans managed to turn the tide, using their small size and simple tools to outmaneuver their opponents. One by one, the cadets were starting to show cracks in their confidence. The first to openly admit doubt was Kadra, a Phyrexian warrior with 6 powerful limbs and a reputation for swift and brutal combat. She had long prided herself on her ability to overwhelm her enemies before they even had a chance to react. But today, as she charged at a human instructor, a man named Sergeant Harris, everything felt wrong. She launched herself forward, her limbs sweeping through the air in a blur of speed. But Harris, as if expecting it, ducked under one of her strikes and used her own momentum to send her crashing into the mat. Kadra's breath caught in her throat. She had never been defeated in such a way before. There was no flashy trick, no use of weapons, just the simple, unassuming power of human technique. "How did you?" she began, but Sergeant Harris was already helping her to her feet. "Don't fight the ground, Kadra," he said quietly. "Use it." It was a simple phrase, but to Kadra, it felt like a revelation. For the first time, she realized that strength alone wouldn't win the battle. The human had known how to direct her power, to use it against herself. Nearby, Captain Vexer noted the look of stunned realization on the Phyrexian's face. He crossed his arms tighter, his scales flickering with silent amusement. This was unexpected. Perhaps, after all, there was more to these humans than anyone had first thought. Across the room, the other cadets were beginning to feel the same shift in their training. No longer was it about brute strength or the flashy displays of power. They were being forced to adapt. They were being forced to learn, and it was frustrating. In one corner of the training hall, Cadet Jurek, a Carathian with an armored exoskeleton and enhanced strength, was squaring off against Sergeant Taylor, a human with a calm demeanor and an unshakable focus. Jurek had fought in countless battles before, his people known for their unparalleled endurance. But Taylor had a way of moving, light, precise, that made Jurek's power seem clumsy in comparison. As they sparred, Jurek found himself growing more and more frustrated. His strength, which had always been his advantage, felt useless here. Every time he tried to overpower the human, Taylor would slip out of his grasp, twisting his body in a way that seemed impossible. In a final, desperate move, Jurek lunged at Taylor, his massive arms swinging toward the human's head. But before he could make contact, Taylor ducked and, with a quick motion, used Jurek's own arm to flip him onto the floor. Jurek gasped, the wind knocked out of him. It was the same technique, the same lesson he had seen in Kadra's sparring. "How did you do that?" he demanded, his voice filled with both awe and frustration. Taylor offered him a hand, his face calm, but with a hint of a smile. "You can't fight force with force. Sometimes you have to fight force with finesse." Jurek didn't speak as he rose to his feet, but the look in his eyes was one of deep thought. He had been humbled, and for the first time, he began to understand what was happening in these lessons. Captain Vexer had seen enough. He knew that the cadets' pride had taken a hit today. They had been humbled by the humans, and it was starting to show. The humans weren't using strength or advanced technology. They were using their minds. They were using their understanding of the body, of combat, in a way that the other species hadn't considered. And it was working. The next day, the training hall buzzed with a new kind of energy. It wasn't the usual arrogance that filled the room, but a hum of quiet anticipation. The cadets, now fully aware that humans were not to be underestimated, stood in small groups, discussing their sparring sessions from the day before. Captain Vexer stood on the raised platform, his iridescent scales gleaming under the bright lights as he surveyed the room. The room had shifted from one of amusement to one of focus, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his cadets. They had been shaken, but they were learning. Today, Vexer's voice echoed across the room, You will face the humans in a more intense challenge. This will be no simple sparring match. I want to see how much you have learned from their strange techniques." The cadets straightened, their eyes narrowing in concentration. It was one thing to face a human in a controlled environment, but this was different. Today, the lessons would be put to the test. One by one, the cadets paired off, each facing the human opponent. Sergeant Harris and Sergeant Taylor, the two humans who had so effectively demonstrated their methods the previous day, stood at the front, ready to oversee the matches. Cadra, the Phyrexian, was up first. Her opponent, Sergeant Harris, stepped forward with an easy smile, his posture relaxed but alert. The contrast between them couldn't have been more striking. Cadra, with her 6 powerful limbs and hardened exoskeleton, looked every bit the warrior. Harris, on the other hand, was unassuming, his human frame far less imposing. The two circled each other, and for a moment, it seemed like a repeat of the previous day. Cadra was fast, her limbs snapping out in a flurry of strikes. But Harris was calm, fluid, his movements a study in precision. Cadra's attacks, while powerful, were too predictable. Harris slipped past them effortlessly, closing the distance between them in a flash. And then, with a single swift motion, he struck. He didn't overpower her. He didn't use brute force. He simply used his hands, redirecting Cadra's momentum, and sending her crashing to the ground once again. Cadra lay there, breathless and stunned, as Harris helped her to her feet. "Remember," he said, his voice calm, "it's not about strength. It's about control." Cadra's mandibles clicked softly as she processed the words. She had been defeated, but something inside her was shifting. She wasn't angry. She was intrigued. The way Harris had fought wasn't about proving who was stronger. It was about making the other person's strength work against them. The next match saw Jarek, the Carathian, face off against Sergeant Taylor. Jarek had been humiliated the day before, but today he was determined to prove himself. His exoskeleton gleamed under the lights, his muscles rippling with every movement. But once again, Taylor's technique was unyielding. The human didn't rely on strength. He didn't need to. Jarek charged, his powerful arms swinging toward Taylor's head. But once again, Taylor ducked, his body moving like water flowing around a rock. He didn't resist Jarek's strength. He simply redirected it, sending the Carathian stumbling forward. Taylor took advantage of the moment, quickly knocking Jarek to the floor with a precise strike to his lower back. Jarek growled in frustration, but there was something else in his eyes now. Respect. For the first time, he understood that it wasn't about overpowering the opponent. It was about making their own power work against them. Captain Vexer observed the cadets, his sharp eyes catching every movement. He knew that the humans were teaching them something that would reshape the way they thought about combat. The cadets, for all their strength, had been relying too much on their physical abilities. The humans were showing them a different way to fight, one that required patience, focus, and an understanding of the opponent's weaknesses. Vexer stepped forward, his voice carrying across the hall. "This is the human way. You must understand it, adapt to it, or you will fail." His words hung in the air as the cadets considered what had just happened. They had learned something important today. They had learned that no matter how strong or fast they were, there was always someone who could outthink them. The room fell into silence as the cadets paired up once again, each now more cautious, more aware of their movements. The training was far from over, but one thing was clear. Humans had more to teach than anyone had ever realized. The days following the first full round of training were intense. The cadets, who had once sneered at the thought of learning from humans, were now fully engrossed in their lessons. Every session became a battle not only with their opponents but with their own pride. Many had underestimated the humans' methods, dismissing them as ineffective. But now, after several intense rounds of sparring, they began to understand the true power behind human hand-to-hand combat. Captain Vexer watched with a mixture of pride and caution. His cadets had always been formidable, but they were learning something that would make them even more dangerous, something that would make them truly unstoppable. They were learning to fight smarter, not just harder. Today's training was set to be the most challenging yet. The cadets had been paired off against each other, but this time, the humans weren't acting as teachers. They were joining the matches as equals. Sergeant Harris and Sergeant Taylor stood on the sidelines, observing but offering no help. Vexer's eyes scanned the room as the first pair of cadets, a towering Gorthian and a swift Solosian, took their places. The Gorthian's massive, scaled body glinted in the light, while the Solosian moved with a grace that was almost unnatural. The two squared off, and the energy in the room was palpable. The cadets were hungry for victory. The match began with a flurry of motion. The Gorthian's powerful fists swung in wide arcs, while the Solosian darted around, using his speed to evade the strikes. It was clear from the start that the Gorthian's strength gave him the advantage in raw power, but the Solosian's agility and tactics allowed him to remain just out of reach. The Gorthian growled in frustration as the Solosian ducked and dodged, using small, well-timed jabs to tire out his larger opponent. But it wasn't enough. In a surprising turn, the Solosian made a mistake. As he attempted to slip past the Gorthian's defenses, he miscalculated the distance and was caught off guard by a crushing blow to the side. The impact sent him sprawling across the mat, gasping for air. The Gorthian stood over him, panting heavily but victorious. He offered a hand to the Solosian, who accepted it with a nod of respect. "Well fought," the Solosian said, his voice breathless. Captain Vexer stepped forward, his tone sharp. "That is the difference between instinct and strategy. The Gorthian used his strength. You used your speed, but you failed to anticipate your opponent's moves. If you want to win, you must think ahead." The next match was between a formidable Carathian and a human cadet named Sergeant Harris. The Carathian, towering over Harris with his dense, muscle-laden frame, seemed to have the obvious advantage. But Harris didn't flinch. He stood there, his posture calm, his eyes locked on his opponent with quiet determination. The fight began, and the Carathian charged with full force, his massive arms swinging toward Harris. The human didn't try to match the Carathian's strength. Instead, he flowed with the attack, sidestepping and using the Carathian's own momentum against him. Harris struck with surgical precision, targeting pressure points and weak spots with astonishing accuracy. The Carathian's attacks were powerful, but they lacked the finesse that Harris demonstrated in every move. The match lasted less than 3 minutes before the Carathian found himself on the floor, winded and disoriented. Harris stood over him, his breathing steady, while the Carathian struggled to rise. "You cannot outmuscle me," Harris said simply, offering the Carathian a hand. "But you can outthink me." The cadets were speechless. What had just happened was impossible by their standards. The Carathian, one of the most skilled warriors in the galaxy, had been defeated in mere moments. The silence in the room was broken only by Captain Vexer's voice. "This is what I've been trying to teach you. It's not enough to be strong. It's not enough to rely on your natural gifts. If you want to win, you must be unpredictable. You must make your enemy's strengths work against them." Vexer's words echoed in the cadets' minds as they moved on to the next round. Each match became more intense, more focused. The cadets were no longer just fighting for victory. They were fighting to understand the human way of combat. They were fighting to understand the very essence of their enemy's strength. The humans, once the underdogs, had proven that their methods were not only effective but transformative. And now, as the cadets faced off against each other in the final round, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. The galaxy's finest warriors had just met their match. The tension in the training hall was palpable. The cadets had been pushed to their limits, their skills tested in ways they never thought possible. But now, the final test was upon them. The culmination of all the lessons, all the pain, and all the bloodshed had led to this moment. Captain Vexer stood at the front of the room, his gaze cold and unwavering. He had witnessed the transformations in his cadets, seen their pride crack and their egos shattered. But this was the moment that would decide everything. The final test wasn't just about physical strength or combat skills. It was about character, discipline, and the willingness to learn from others. "Listen up, cadets," Vexor's voice rang out, commanding attention. "The final test will not be against each other. You will face your greatest challenge yet, a human." There was a collective gasp in the room. For the past several weeks, the cadets had been learning from humans, absorbing their techniques and strategies. But now they were being told that the final test would be one of them, a human cadet. Sergeant Harris stepped forward, his expression unreadable. The humans had shown their combat prowess time and time again, but now they were going to test the cadets' understanding of what they had been taught. The stakes were higher than ever. "I hope you've learned everything I've taught you," Harris said, his voice steady. "Because today, you're not fighting to win. You're fighting to survive." The cadets exchanged uneasy glances. It was one thing to spar with humans in training, but this was different. This was the real thing. The first pair of cadets to step up were a pair of seasoned veterans, one a Kraz, with her thick, armored hide and razor-sharp claws, the other a stealthy, swift Archon. Both were skilled in their respective fields, each with years of combat experience under their belts. But they both knew this would be different. Harris faced the Kraz first. The Kraz roared and lunged forward, her claws slashing through the air with deadly precision. Harris sidestepped effortlessly, his movements fluid and calculated. The Kraz's attacks were powerful, but predictable. Harris wasn't concerned with overpowering her. He was concerned with using her strength against her. As the Kraz's claws swept toward him, Harris dropped low, using his smaller frame to duck under her attack. In a split second, he struck, a quick jab to her side, targeting a pressure point just beneath her armor. The Kraz froze, her eyes widening in shock. Her body involuntarily spasmed from the hit, leaving her vulnerable. With a quick movement, Harris grabbed her arm and twisted, using her momentum to throw her off balance. The Kraz hit the ground with a thud, gasping for air. "That's not strength," Harris said, his voice calm. "It's precision." The cadets stood in stunned silence. They had all seen powerful fighters, but they had never seen someone manipulate strength so effortlessly. The lesson was clear. Strength could only take you so far. In the end, it was strategy and the ability to anticipate your opponent's moves that would determine victory. Next, it was the Archon's turn. Unlike the Kraz, the Archon relied on speed and agility, darting in and out of his opponent's reach with lightning-fast strikes. Harris wasn't caught off guard. He knew the Archon's style, having studied it in the training room. He was prepared. The Archon struck first, his claws aimed for Harris' chest, but Harris was already moving, stepping aside, and sending the Archon's strike slicing through empty air. The Archon's attacks were relentless, but they were also predictable. Every move followed a pattern. Every strike was timed in a way that could be anticipated. Harris used the Archon's momentum against him once again, grabbing hold of the Archon's arm as he attempted another strike. In a fluid motion, Harris twisted and swept the Archon's legs out from under him. The Archon hit the ground with a painful crash, his claws scraping across the floor. "Speed is nothing if you don't know where you're going," Harris said, extending a hand to help the Archon up. "You have to control your moves, otherwise they control you." The cadets were beginning to understand. This wasn't just about learning new techniques. It was about unlearning everything they thought they knew. It was about adapting, thinking ahead, and always being ready for the unexpected. Captain Vexor stood silent, watching the cadets carefully. He knew that they were struggling with the idea that they could be beaten by someone they had once considered weaker. But he also knew that this final test was necessary. The cadets needed to understand that power came in many forms. As the final match began, the room grew quiet. There was no doubt now that the human cadets had earned their place in the galaxy's greatest military academy. But they had one last challenge to face. The challenge of proving that their strength, their human strength, was enough to overcome even the greatest odds. Vexor's eyes narrowed, and he stepped forward. "Prepare yourselves," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "This is the true test of everything you've learned." The air in the training hall was thick with anticipation. The cadets had seen their comrades fall, defeated not by raw strength, but by the cunning and skill of a human instructor. Now it was their turn. The ultimate challenge awaited them, one last test that would decide if they truly understood the lessons they had been taught. Captain Vexor stood at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the cadets. They had all been pushed beyond their limits, broken down, and rebuilt. They had learned that strength wasn't the sole measure of a warrior. It was adaptability, precision, and above all, mental fortitude. Vexor's voice cut through the silence. "You have learned much, but this final test will prove if you are truly ready. You will face me." The cadet's eyes widened. Facing Vexor was no small task. He was a master of combat, an experienced fighter whose tactical genius had earned him a place among the galaxy's elite. They had sparred with humans, but now they were about to face one of their own. Harris stepped forward, his face unreadable. "This is it," he said. "This is where everything you've learned comes together. Vexor is the ultimate test. He'll push you to the edge. But if you adapt, you might just stand a chance." The cadets lined up, each one sizing up their opponent. The room seemed to hold its breath as Vexor cracked his knuckles, his body poised for the fight. "Cadet Cathal," Vexor called, his voice like a thunderclap. "You're first." Cathal, the towering Manadin, stepped forward, his blade-like forearms flexing. The other cadets watched with a mixture of fear and admiration. Cathal was known for his ferocity, a warrior who had taken down countless opponents in his time. He was one of the best the Academy had to offer. But this was different. This was Captain Vexor. Cathal lunged, his sharp claws aimed for Vexor's throat. But Vexor was faster, his body twisting and dodging with an almost unnatural grace. Cathal's claws swiped through empty air as Vexor closed the distance, landing a quick, hard blow to Cathal's side. The room gasped as Cathal stumbled back, struggling to regain his footing. He had never been hit like that before. Vexor's eyes gleamed with a cold intensity. "You're strong, Cathal, but strength isn't enough. You need more than just power. You need control." Cathal growled in frustration, charging again. But Vexor was already several steps ahead, dodging and weaving with ease. Each of Cathal's strikes was blocked or deflected, his attacks growing more desperate as the fight wore on. Finally, Vexor landed a decisive blow, striking Cathal's pressure point and sending him crashing to the ground. The room fell silent as Cathal lay there, panting and defeated. Vexor stepped back, giving Cathal a moment to recover. "You fought well," he said, his voice softening just a touch. "But you were predictable. In combat, predictability is a weakness." Cathal nodded, his pride bruised but his resolve intact. He knew he had much to learn. One by one, the cadets faced Vexor, each attempting to use what they had learned. But one by one, they fell. The battles were brutal, each opponent testing Vexor's strength, agility, and intellect. But no matter how skilled they were, they couldn't match Vexor's experience and strategic mind. The cadets realized that this fight wasn't just about physical strength. It was about the ability to adapt, to think on your feet, and to use everything you had learned. As the last cadet, an Arkan named Janik, stepped forward, the room was tense. Janik had been a standout throughout the training, known for his speed and precision. He was one of the most promising cadets, and the other cadets had placed their hopes on him. Janik's eyes narrowed as he faced Vexor. He knew this was his moment to prove himself. He darted forward with lightning speed, his claws slashing toward Vexor's throat. Vexor's eyes locked onto Janik, studying his every move. For the first time during the entire challenge, he didn't move immediately. Instead, he waited, waiting for Janik to make a mistake. And it came. As Janek aimed for the throat, Vexor anticipated his move, stepping to the side and countering with a swift jab to Janek's midsection. Janek gasped for breath, feeling the wind knocked out of him. But he didn't give up. He was fast, and he knew that speed was his only chance. He recovered quickly and launched another series of rapid attacks, but Vexor continued to dodge, his movements fluid and calculated. Finally, with a sudden burst of energy, Janek feinted a high strike and aimed for Vexor's legs. But Vexor was ready. In a single, fluid motion, he swept Janek's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. Janek lay there, breathing heavily, defeated but not broken. "You were right," he said, his voice filled with respect. "It's not enough to be fast. I need to think. I need to control a fight." Vexor nodded, extending a hand to help Janek up. "You've learned well. The true test of a warrior isn't just in how they fight. It's in how they adapt. And you, Janek, have shown you can adapt." The room erupted in applause as the cadets realized the lesson had been learned. Strength, speed, and power were important, but they were only pieces of the puzzle. In the end, it was the ability to adapt, to learn, and to control the fight that made the true warrior. Captain Vexor looked over his class of cadets, pride swelling in his chest. They had all grown, all transformed into something more than they were before, and as they stood there, victorious in their own way, he knew that they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead in the galaxy. "Congratulations, cadets," Vexor said, his voice steady and full of pride. "You have earned your place among the stars."